Hey everyone, welcome to the show. Ever feel trapped by those good girl expectations? Like there's this invisible rule book telling you how to be, how to act, how to succeed.
It's a feeling so many women know all too well, Rhea.
Absolutely. But what if we could tear up that rule book and rewrite the script?
Well, that's exactly what we're diving into today.
Exactly. We're cracking open Break the Good Girl Myth by Majo Molfino, a total game changer in the world of self-help and personal growth. By the way, you can find a link to the book in the description.
This book isn't just about boosting confidence. It goes way deeper, exploring how these often invisible societal pressures impact women's lives and offering a roadmap to break free and design a life that's truly aligned with who you are.
All right, so let's paint a picture here. Think about that classic good girl archetype.
Oh, the one who always got perfect grades, played piano flawlessly, followed every rule, never caused a fuss.
And always had a smile plastered on her face.
Exactly. The pressure to be perfect, agreeable, and always put others first is immense.
It's like we're handed this invisible scorecard from day one and told to rack up those good girl points. But here's the thing. These expectations don't just appear out of thin air. They're deeply rooted in a much larger system. The patriarchy.
Now, I know that word can sometimes feel a bit loaded.
Totally. And it's not just about men being in charge. This is about understanding how the patriarchy is actually intertwined with other oppressive systems like white supremacy and capitalism.
That's right. It's this complex web where each system reinforces the others, creating these incredibly persistent inequalities. So we're talking about a system that prioritizes whiteness, wealth, and traditional masculinity, which has been the dominant culture for centuries.
And think about it. The impact of the system is everywhere. Look at how household products are marketed, the subtle messages on shampoo bottles, the gendered colors of baby clothes. Even shoe designs and technology aren't immune. It's woven into the fabric of our everyday lives.
And the really insidious thing is that the system doesn't just hurt women. It puts men in a box, too.
Right. Think about the pressure on men to be tough, unemotional, the classic strong, silent type. It's incredibly limiting.
Exactly. And then, of course, there are the children who are pushed into these rigid gender roles from the moment they're born. Pink for girls, blue for boys, and a whole set of expectations that come along with those colors.
It's this constant messaging that limits everyone's ability to express themselves authentically.
Now, this leads to a really important question. How does this whole system perpetuate itself? Who's responsible for keeping it going?
Well, Molfino introduces the idea of messengers of the patriarchy. And the key here is understanding that these aren't necessarily bad people with malicious intent.
Exactly. These messengers can be of any gender, age, background, or belief system. They're essentially the carriers of these cultural norms, often passing them on without even realizing the harm they're causing.
It's like they're unknowingly upholding this invisible script.
Precisely. It's not about pointing fingers or assigning blame. It's about recognizing the power of the system itself and how we all, to some extent, participate in it.
And speaking of recognizing these patterns, Majo Molfino, the author, has a really interesting perspective. She calls herself a good girl in serious recovery.
Well, that's such a relatable term, isn't it?
Totally. As a Latina immigrant, she knows firsthand the immense pressure to follow the rules and please others.
And her journey is super inspiring. After years in a traditional job, she ended up at Stanford getting her master's in learning, design, and technology.
Talk about a plot twist. It was there that she discovered design thinking, which completely changed her trajectory.
Design thinking at its core is about problem solving and challenging the status quo. And that's exactly what we need to do with this whole good girl myth.
It's like using design thinking to dismantle the old script and create a new one that's more authentic and empowering.
Now, to do that, Molfino identifies 5 good girl myths that keep women stuck in these limiting patterns.
All right, lay them on us. What are these sneaky myths?
They are rules, perfection, logic, harmony, and sacrifice.
Oh, those are all way too familiar.
Right. And they might seem like individual issues, but they're all interconnected and work together to keep women small and prevent them from reaching their full potential.
Okay, so let's break these down one by one, starting with the myth of rules. What's the strategy here?
Well, the strategy is to be proper, follow every expectation, and never step out of line.
Which sounds exhausting, honestly.
Totally. But the bigger problem is that in trying so hard to be good, we end up silencing our true selves and giving up our authenticity.
It's like trading your unique voice for a pat on the head.
Exactly. Now, the next one, the myth of perfection. This one's a real doozy.
Oh, I know this one all too well. The constant pressure to be flawless in everything you do.
Right. And the crazy thing is, even when we achieve something amazing, it's never enough. There's always this nagging feeling that we could have done better.
It's like we're our own worst critics, always striving for an unattainable ideal.
And the price we pay for this constant pursuit of perfection is our own self-compassion. We're so busy judging ourselves that we forget to be kind to ourselves.
It's a recipe for burnout and unhappiness.
Absolutely. Then there's the myth of logic, which tells us that we need to be rational and credible all the time.
Ah, yes, the classic head over heart approach.
Right. And while logic is important, relying solely on it means we often ignore our intuition, our creativity, and our empathy.
Those are some pretty big things to sacrifice.
They are. And it can lead to feeling disconnected from our own inner wisdom and from the people around us.
Then we have the myth of harmony, where the main goal is to avoid conflict at all costs.
Always be agreeable, never rock the boat, keep everyone happy, even if it means silencing yourself.
Which, let's be honest, is impossible to do all the time.
And it's actually incredibly unhealthy. Because when we suppress our true feelings and avoid necessary disagreements, we end up sacrificing our own voice and our own truth.
It's like we're constantly walking on eggshells, afraid to express our real opinions or needs.
Exactly. And lastly, we have the myth of sacrifice, the queen of all the good girl myths.
Oh, this one's a biggie. The belief that we must always put everyone else's needs before our own.
Always be selfless, always be helpful, even if it means neglecting your own well-being and your own dreams.
Which is a recipe for resentment and burnout in the long run.
Right. We end up giving away our most precious resources, our time and energy, and we often don't even realize it.
So we've got these 5 myths, rules, perfection, logic, harmony, and sacrifice, all working together to keep us trapped in this good girl cage. But where do we even begin to dismantle this whole thing?
Well, Molfino argues that the myth of rules is the foundation, is like the root system of all the other myths.
So if we can crack the code on the myth of rules, the rest will start to crumble.
Precisely, because all the other myths have their own set of hidden rules operating beneath the surface. For example, the myth of harmony says, don't make waves, keep everyone happy, even if it means sacrificing your own needs. And the myth of sacrifice whispers, your needs are less important than everyone else's.
So the key is learning to question both the obvious and the not-so-obvious rules that are governing our lives.
Exactly. And it helps to understand that there are 2 types of rules: visible rules and invisible rules. Visible rules are those clear-cut laws and regulations with defined consequences. Think traffic laws, school policies, that sort of thing.
Right, those are the ones we can't really get away with breaking.
Yeah.
But it's the invisible rules that really trip us up, right?
Absolutely. These are the unspoken social norms and expectations that we often absorb without even realizing it. They're not written down anywhere, but they're all around us, dictating how we should behave and how we should live our lives.
So it's like those internal should statements that pop into our heads all the time. I should always say yes. I should never disappoint anyone. I should be able to do it all.
Exactly. And these shoulds are often based on cultural conditioning, societal expectations, and even things we learned in childhood. And they can be incredibly powerful because they're often enforced by shame and fear.
Right. It's that fear of judgment, that fear of not being accepted or loved that keeps us from questioning these invisible rules.
Exactly. And sometimes these rules might have served a purpose at one point in our lives. Maybe in childhood they helped keep us safe or gain approval from our parents. But as adults, blindly following rules that no longer serve us can be incredibly limiting.
It's like we're still operating from that old childhood script, even though we're grown adults now.
Now, institutions play a massive role in perpetuating these rules. Schools, for instance, are all about rules and expectations.
Oh, totally. Show up on time, do your homework, get good grades, follow the dress code.
Right. And there's some interesting research showing that girls consistently perform better academically than boys across various studies.
But it's not necessarily because girls are inherently smarter.
No. The suggestion is that the school system often rewards those who excel at following rules and meeting expectations, which aligns with how girls are often socialized.
Then there's religion, which is often based on a set of doctrines and moral codes that dictate what's considered right and wrong.
And this can be particularly damaging when it comes to women's sexuality.
Right. Because many religions impose these restrictive rules around purity and modesty that can lead to deep-seated shame and even trauma around natural sexual desires and experiences.
It's this really unfortunate combination of religious dogma and the myth of rules, which can have a long-lasting impact on women's lives.
So how do we start to identify these invisible rules that are secretly running the show in our own lives?
The book suggests we think about the areas where we tend to get the most gold stars in life. What are the things we do that earn us praise and approval?
It's like thinking about the times when you feel the most pressure to perform or conform to expectations.
Exactly. And ask yourself, where do these expectations come from? Are they coming from my family, my culture, my religion, the media? And more importantly, do they actually align with my own values and desires?
It's about becoming aware of those constant should statements that pop into our heads and then questioning where they're coming from and whether they're truly serving us.
Because here's the thing. You might be thinking, is it really a bad thing that I want to be a good mom or a good employee? And it's not that those desires themselves are negative. It's that the definitions of good are often imposed on us by external forces.
So it's not about rejecting those roles or responsibilities. It's about defining what good means to you on your own terms, not based on someone else's expectations.
Precisely. And that's where reframing comes in, which is a really powerful tool from the world of design thinking.
Okay, tell us more about reframing.
Reframing is all about consciously choosing to look at a problem or a situation from a different angle, maybe even the complete opposite of how we usually see it. It's about shifting our perspective to open up new possibilities and find more empowering interpretations of our experiences.
The book shares this great example of a client who was feeling a lot of shame about having been divorced twice before turning 40.
Oh, that's something so many people struggle with, feeling like a failure when a relationship ends.
Totally. But through coaching, they explored reframing that experience. Instead of seeing it as a failure, what if it was failing fast in relationships that weren't a good fit?
I love that reframe. It takes away so much of the self-blame and judgment and allows for a more positive interpretation of the past.
It reminds me of this quote from Roz Savage, the woman who rode across oceans solo. Living your life as if you're writing a story about it later makes you the heroine of your own life.
Oh, that's a good one.
Right. It encourages us to seek out those challenging and transformative experiences because they ultimately make for a better story.
And that really connects with the idea of the heroine's journey, which is all about embracing our challenges and emerging stronger and wiser on the other side.
So when it comes to reframing the myth of rules, the book offers this really helpful shift in perspective. Instead of believing there's a right path and a wrong path, we can embrace the idea that all paths are fine, so I'll keep on walking.
It's about letting go of that paralyzing fear of making the wrong decision. So many of us, especially those of us raised with that good girl mentality, get stuck in overthinking and analysis paralysis.
We're so afraid of messing up that we end up not doing anything at all.
Exactly. The book reminds us that life is about iteration, just like the design process. It's about trying things out, making mistakes, learning, and adjusting course along the way. There's no one perfect predetermined path.
And I love the analogy they use. Something purple can also be elastic and soft. It can have multiple qualities at the same time.
Right. It's like with our own identities. We're complex beings with many different facets and interests. We don't have to fit ourselves into one neat little box.
And that ties into the first ingredient of meaning that the book explores, the wisdom of joy.
Oh, tell me more about this.
Well, they share the story of a client, Christy, who is feeling really lost and unfulfilled, like she completely lost touch with what truly mattered to her.
I think so many of us can relate to that feeling.
Totally. And to help Christy reconnect with her joy, they asked her some really simple but powerful questions. What brings you joy? What did you enjoy doing as a child? Because joy, the book emphasizes, is something we actually feel in our bodies.
It's not just an intellectual concept, it's a visceral experience.
Exactly. And when Christy started to tap into her joy, she had these really strong physical reactions. She felt tears welling up, a lump in her throat. It was this deep emotional and physical release.
And that's something that the myth of rules and the myth of perfection really try to suppress.
Right, we're so busy following the rules and striving for perfection that we forget to make space for those things that bring us genuine joy. And the problem with that is that enjoyment and engagement are really closely linked.
If we're not enjoying what we're doing, we're much less likely to stay connected to it, to feel motivated, and to put in the effort to really excel.
Exactly, and that's where flow comes in.
Flow.
Yeah. Remember that feeling when you're completely absorbed in an activity and time just seems to fly by?
Oh yeah, when you're so focused that you completely lose track of everything else.
That's flow, that sweet spot between challenge and skill, where you feel completely engaged in the zone.
It's a really powerful state, and when we can find it in our work, it makes all the difference.
So the book encourages us to identify those activities that make us lose all track of time. What are the things that completely absorb us? Because those activities can give us really valuable clues about the kind of work that would be most meaningful for us, even if they currently seem like just hobbies.
And sometimes those new directions don't come from some big, dramatic epiphany, but from these quiet little whispers of curiosity.
Like in Christie's case, she had always doodled in the margins of her notebooks as a kid, and that little spark of interest eventually led her to explore hand lettering and printmaking, which then blossomed into teaching her own workshops.
It's amazing how those seemingly small interests can sometimes lead to these incredible journeys.
It reminds me of this quote from Isabel Allende. No one is born a heroine. What makes a heroine is the trials. It's not about starting out perfect or fearless. It's about facing our challenges and growing through those experiences.
I love that.
Right. It's about embracing the messy, imperfect process of becoming. And speaking of challenges, the book encourages us to reflect on those difficult moments in our lives, the times when we really struggled.
Because often those are the times when we learn the most valuable lessons.
Exactly. So, what were your biggest life challenges? What were those moments of conflict or trauma where you had to dig deep and find your strength?
Reflecting on those experiences, even the painful ones, can help us understand our own resilience and identify the patterns that might be holding us back.
Now, another really interesting ingredient of meaning that the book explores is thinking about our lives from the perspective of death.
Okay, that might sound a bit morbid.
It might, but it's actually a really powerful tool for gaining clarity and perspective on what truly matters. As Steve Jobs famously said, remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life.
Because when we remember that our time is limited, it helps us strip away all the external noise and expectations and focus on what's truly important to us.
So the book suggests we ask ourselves this question. If I were to die in 5 years, what 3 things would I deeply regret not doing?
It's a really powerful question that can help us cut through all the distractions and identify our true priorities.
Now, I know death can be a really uncomfortable topic for some people, but many spiritual traditions actually use death meditations to help us connect with the present moment and appreciate the preciousness of life.
So we've talked about the importance of tuning into our joy, reflecting on our suffering, and considering our mortality. But what do we do with all these ingredients of meaning?
Well, the next step is brainstorming. And I know brainstorming can feel like a bit of a cliche, but it's actually a super valuable skill.
Absolutely. It's all about generating as many ideas as possible in a given time frame, without judgment or criticism.
It's like giving ourselves permission to think outside the box and explore all sorts of possibilities.
And the book outlines some really helpful guidelines for effective brainstorming, like setting a clear time limit, focusing on quantity over quality, and encouraging those wild and wacky ideas.
Because you never know where those crazy ideas might lead. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Instead of feeling like we have to choose just one ingredient of meaning, the book encourages us to brainstorm through blending.
How does that mean?
It means combining 2 or more ingredients of meaning to create something entirely new. Like remember Christie with her diverse interests? Chocolate making, interaction design, cooking, crafting.
Oh yeah, she had a lot going on.
Right. And instead of feeling overwhelmed by having to pick just one, she started brainstorming ways to blend those interests. Could she create interactive chocolate experiences? What about teaching cooking classes that incorporated elements of design thinking?
I love that. It's like using those different ingredients to create a recipe that's uniquely her own.
Exactly. And this blending of interests can also be a powerful way to overcome the feeling of not being qualified enough, which is something that so many of us struggle with.
Oh, tell me about it.
The book shares the story of Jade, an art director in publishing, who felt completely out of her depth when she was asked to speak on a panel about women in product design.
Because she didn't have a tech background.
Right. But instead of focusing on what she perceived as a lack of technical expertise, she realized that her background in art direction was actually a huge asset in the world of tech branding.
It's about recognizing the value of our existing skills and experiences and finding creative ways to apply them in new contexts.
Exactly. So this whole chapter really gives us a solid toolkit for dismantling the myth of rules. We've got our invisible rules checklist to help us uncover those hidden expectations, our 4 pathway reframes to shift our perspective, the ingredients of meaning process for exploring what truly matters, and death meditation for gaining clarity on our priorities.
It's like giving ourselves permission to rewrite the script and create a life that's more aligned with who we truly are.
Absolutely. Now, let's move on to the myth of perfection, where the strategy is to achieve, 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 and be flawless in everything you do.
Oh, but the price we pay for this constant striving is our self-compassion.
Right. And if you were someone who was often praised for being gifted or talented as a child, this myth might resonate really strongly with you.
Because you learn to equate your worth with your accomplishments.
Exactly. And while praise can be motivating, research shows that the type of praise we receive as children can actually make a huge difference in how we view challenges later in life.
So parents of boys tend to use more process praise, focusing on their efforts and strategies. Like, wow, you really stuck with that puzzle until you figured it out.
While parents of girls often use more person praise, focusing on their inherent traits, like, you're so smart, you got an A without even trying.
And what's interesting is that children who receive more process praise tend to develop a more positive attitude towards challenges. They see setbacks as opportunities for growth and learning.
Which is what Carol Dweck calls a growth mindset.
Exactly. But person praise can actually be detrimental, especially for girls.
Because it creates this pressure to always live up to that label of being smart or talented.
Right. And when they inevitably face challenges or make mistakes, it can really damage their self-esteem and motivation.
This fear of not being perfect can be so paralyzing. It prevents us from taking risks, trying new things, and even just enjoying the process.
The book shares the author's own experience with drawing. She loved to draw as a child, but had this really discouraging experience with a teacher who critiqued her work.
Oof, I can relate to that.
Right. And it made her so afraid of not being good enough that she stopped drawing altogether for years.
It's crazy how one experience can have such a lasting impact on our creativity and willingness to put ourselves out there.
Absolutely. And this fear of imperfection can show up in our professional lives as well.
Oh, totally. The book talks about Jade, the VP of product design, who actually turned down a speaking opportunity on a panel about women in tech.
Because she didn't feel qualified.
Exactly. Even though she was a senior leader in her field, she didn't feel like she was techie enough.
It's like that feeling that we have to be perfect experts before we can share our knowledge or pursue our goals.
And that's the really frustrating paradox of the myth of perfection. It prevents us from taking the very actions we need to actually improve and grow.
So what's the antidote to this perfectionism paralysis?
The book offers prototyping, which comes from, you guessed it, design thinking.
Prototyping, that's interesting.
Right. It's all about breaking down a big goal into smaller, more manageable chunks and embracing this idea of good enough.
So instead of striving for perfection right out of the gate, we create rough drafts and test them out, knowing that they're not going to be perfect.
Exactly. It's like creating a safe space to make mistakes and learn from them.
And that takes the pressure off.
It does. Remember Jade's desire to start a podcast? Well, instead of trying to create a perfectly produced episode right away, she started by recording a 3-minute voice memo on her phone.
That's a great example of prototyping.
Right. It allowed her to get started without getting bogged down in all the technical details.
And the key to effective prototyping is to keep those prototypes small and manageable. It's about focusing on progress over perfection.
And the other important piece is sharing those prototypes with others, even though it can feel really vulnerable.
Because feedback is essential for learning and growth.
Exactly. But sharing our work, especially when it's not perfect, can feel really scary.
So to help with that, the book introduces this concept of the vulnerability edge.
Okay, what's that?
It's that sweet spot between staying completely safe in your comfort zone and pushing yourself so far that you feel completely overwhelmed.
So it's like finding that balance between challenging yourself and not freaking yourself out.
Exactly. It's about identifying a gift or an idea that you're afraid to share, and then brainstorming different ways to share it, ranking them by how scary they feel, and then choosing one that feels a little bit uncomfortable, but not completely terrifying.
That's a really helpful framework. Now, to counteract the deeply ingrained belief that our worth is tied to what we do and achieve, the book offers this powerful mantra: my worthiness is inherent. It is not tied to my productivity or achievements.
Oh, that's a good one.
Right, because under the myth of perfection, we're constantly striving and proving ourselves, never feeling like we're enough.
It's exhausting.
Totally. So repeating this mantra can help us reconnect with our intrinsic value and release that pressure to constantly perform.
And another helpful practice for shifting from doing to being is non-doing meditation.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's non-doing meditation?
It's a simple practice where you focus on your breath for a short period, maybe 5 to 10 minutes, without trying to change anything. Thoughts will inevitably come up, and that's totally normal.
Yeah.
You just gently redirect your attention back to your breath.
It's about cultivating a sense of stillness and allowing yourself to just be without judgment or the need to achieve anything.
Exactly. And when we practice this regularly, it can help us create more space in our lives and reduce that feeling of overwhelm that often comes with the myth of perfection.
Now, another really important aspect of overcoming perfectionism is setting clear boundaries, especially around work.
Oh, yes, boundaries are crucial.
Because under the myth of perfection, we often feel this pressure to be constantly productive and available, which can lead to burnout and a total lack of balance in our lives.
The book shares the story of Zoe, who was totally addicted to achievement and would constantly cancel plans with friends and family to work late into the night.
And she was completely miserable.
But she eventually realized that her well-being was far more important than striving for some unattainable ideal of perfect work. So she started setting some firm boundaries, like leaving work by 6 p.m. each day.
And how did that go?
Initially, she felt a lot of guilt and anxiety. But eventually, she realized that the world didn't end when she stepped away from work.
It's amazing how hard it can be to give ourselves permission to rest and recharge.
It is. And the book encourages us to identify those should activities that are draining us, and then consider whether we can eliminate them, delegate them to someone else, or automate them using tools like the Eisenhower matrix.
It's about being really intentional with our time and energy and saying no to those things that aren't truly serving us.
And they also talk about the importance of sequencing our projects instead of trying to do everything at once.
Right, because when we try to do too much at once, we end up feeling overwhelmed and scattered.
Exactly. Keeping an idea folder can be really helpful here.
An idea folder, what's that?
It's just a place to jot down those new ideas that come up instead of jumping on them immediately. Give those ideas some time to marinate and see if they still feel exciting and relevant after a few days or weeks.
That's a great tip.
And they also touch on the underlying issue of control that often fuels perfectionism.
Because if we can control everything, we can avoid making mistakes and facing those feelings of inadequacy.
Exactly. But that's not how life works.
Huh.
So learning to embrace imperfection and let go of that need for control is essential.
And sometimes all it takes is a little shift in perspective. The book tells this great anecdote about an older man at Stanford who, noticing the author looking stressed and overwhelmed, said to her, "If you're unhappy like this, imagine how ordinary folk feel."
Wow, that's a good one.
Right. It's a reminder that even when we're struggling, we still have a lot to be grateful for.
And to broaden our perspective even further, as Carl Sagan once said, our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark.
Wow, that puts things in perspective, doesn't it?
It really does. So, to recap, the essential tools for overcoming the myth of perfection are prototyping, embraces our vulnerability edge, practicing the doing to being mantra, non-doing meditation, and setting clear boundaries, especially around work.
It's like giving ourselves permission to be human, to make mistakes, and to prioritize our well-being.
Exactly. All right, now let's move on to the myth of logic, where the main strategy for gaining approval is being smart and credible, always relying on logic and reason.
But the price we pay for this is often our intuition, our imagination, and our capacity for empathy.
Right. It's like we're disconnecting from those deeper, more intuitive ways of knowing. And to illustrate this, the book opens with a really powerful story about the author's mother as a child being severely electrocuted.
Oh, wow. That's intense.
It is. And in this terrifying moment, her grandmother had this inexplicable knowing that she needed to turn off the electricity to the entire house. And that intuition ended up saving her daughter's life.
Wow, that's incredible.
It really highlights that there's a kind of knowing that goes beyond pure logic and reason.
And the book explores how societal messages, especially those aimed at girls, often teach us to distrust our bodies and our feelings.
Right. Think about all those messages we get about how our bodies should look, how we should dress, how we should behave.
It's like we're constantly being told to control and suppress our natural impulses.
Exactly. And this can be made even worse by experiences of trauma, such as sexual assault, which can create this protective disconnect between the mind and the body.
It's like our bodies become something to be feared or controlled, rather than trusted sources of wisdom and pleasure.
And then, of course, there's the whole cultural shaming of emotions, which affects both men and women.
Oh, totally. Like those dismissive terms we use to describe emotional responses, like pussies and hysterical.
It's all about devaluing and silencing emotional expression, especially in women. And it's important to remember that The term hysteria was actually a fabricated medical diagnosis used to control women and dismiss their experiences.
It's a reminder of how deeply rooted these patriarchal patterns are.
Absolutely. And the book really emphasizes the importance of allowing ourselves to feel the full spectrum of human emotions, even the messy, uncomfortable ones.
Because, as Brené Brown says, we can't selectively numb emotions.
Right. If we try to suppress the difficult feelings, we also limit our capacity for joy, love, and connection.
It's like we're cutting ourselves off from the richness of the human experience.
Exactly. And to help us reconnect with our emotions, the book introduces this simple mindfulness practice. When a negative emotion arises, take a moment to pause, close your eyes, and just observe the physical sensations in your body.
Like noticing the tightness in your chest, the knot in your stomach, the shallowness of your breath.
Exactly. Just notice those sensations without judgment or the need to change them. And you might find that by simply paying attention to those physical sensations, the emotions start to shift and move through you more easily.
It's like creating space for those feelings to exist without getting completely overwhelmed by them.
Exactly. And finding healthy ways to express our emotions is also really important, whether it's through journaling, talking to a trusted friend or a therapist, or